Hi Arihant, I hope you're well.
Hey Joy, good evening. How are you?
Very well. I hope you're well. I hope you're able to hear me clearly.
Yeah, Joy, I'm able to hear you.
Hello everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, and I'd like to wish you all a very good evening. Um, we have a few. We have the right number of attendees on, so I think let's get started with this webinar. Before we go into details, I'll just maybe quickly spend a few minutes, giving you all a very quick introduction and like a little bit more context to the webinar in terms of, what can we expect over the next 1 hour or so. To get started, we'll like talk a little bit about our data science program, which is, one of, in fact, oldest programs at MIT. After that, we'll spend some time about like the data science industry as a whole to give you a little bit more flavor of what you can expect well as a data scientist. And then we'll talk a little bit about like our data science pro degree again towards the end, where we'll give you some more facets about this particular program and the role that is played by KPMG in delivering and creating this program along with Imarticus Learning. So I think with that background, we also have enough time for your questions and answers. So in case you have questions, again, feel free to use like the questions tab. You have like a Q&A tab on the webinar. So feel free to use that to ask us any questions, and we'll be happy to take them. And we'll get Arihant from KPMG to help you answer those as well. Right. So I think, in fact, with that, I'd like to get started. To give you a quick background again, like the data science pro degree is, one of the oldest and the most popular programs that we run at Imarticus. We have trained upwards of tens of thousands of students over the last 5 years in this particular program. And we are extremely proud to associate with KPMG in India. And, with that backdrop, I would like to welcome Arihant Garg to this session. We have Arihant with us today. He is currently the partner with the analytics practice at KPMG. Well, he has been a part of several IT and digital transformation projects with upwards of 15 years of experience. And again, out of those 15 years, he spent about 14 odd years with KPMG itself. In terms of his background and his role, he manages the end-to-end of analytics across strategy, across implementations and dashboarding and reporting. So with that background, I would like to welcome you to this session, Arihant.
Thanks, Joy. Good evening, everybody.
Yeah, we're able to see you now. Hi, good evening. So, we have a few people. We have about 70 odd people here. I think let's, take some questions from them as we go along. So we'll keep it quite, fluid in terms of the structure. But to get started, I wanted to ask you this, question. It's been on my head since, it's in fact been on my mind since the last few weeks. We keep hearing about how data science is, in fact, termed as like the sexiest job of the 21st century. Well, are there any views that you have on that particular subject or that particular title as such?
Sure, Joy. So, in fact, I would say that let's go about like 20 years back. So, probably 20 years back, ERP used to be the sexiest job on the planet. So, every organization essentially was going to implement ERP, CRM, CM. And a lot of enterprise class applications. This used to be a trend, I think, till about 10 years back. And now you see the second generation rollout of ERP, CRM, SCM, these kind of tools. You've got SAP, Oracle, Arivas of the world in this space. So what has happened in organizations is, over these, especially about last decade, a lot of data has got generated. So, ERP is there, so every transaction is getting recorded. Then we have got a CRM in place, we have got SCM in place, we've got distributor management systems in place, and then we've got a lot of social media data coming into place, and then with industry IoT and the normal IoT, a lot of data is getting produced. So the reason essentially data science has suddenly become popular is because organizations have started realizing that now when they're capturing a lot of data, can they do something with that data? Can this data be used to essentially get insights which help them in actually doing, let's say better decision making, can get them insights on their competition in terms of how they are doing in a particular geography. And that's the reason data science has become a lot more popular now, because organizations have actually got a tons of data.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of, so you mentioned about the organizations, having data nowadays in terms of, how they're in fact structured and how they're created. Could you give us a quick background in terms of, how does an organization look like today when it comes to its analytics, like, vertical or like the organizational structure within analytics particularly?
So if you look at, analytics and data science has become very, very important for every organization today. So typically, analytics would be a separate vertical within the corporate. It might report to, let's say, the strategy head. It might report to, let's say, the business excellence head or some of these things. But, it is definitely one of the most important vertical within the organization. And when you say, what it covers is, typically, analytics would cover three things. One, essentially, it will cover the data engineering part in terms of getting all the data together. So you have got something in, let's say, ERP, CRM, SCM, some part in IoT, some part essentially data over the cloud and SaaS applications. Then you have got some part in terms of, SCADA systems. One part is essentially, can I get the entire data at one place? So data engineering becomes very, very important. The second part essentially is on the visualization side in terms of how do you look at the data. And then the third part essentially is on data science. So all three combined essentially becomes the analytics team of an organization. And today, one part is, all organizations have it, and another dimension to this is, a lot of organizations, large organizations, like the best of the banks in the world today, they've got data science team which is probably upwards of 200, 300 people, and a lot of that is essentially based out of captives in India.
Okay. So when you say like the verticals, you're obviously referring to, one team on engineering, maybe another one on like the visualization, and the other one on like the data science or the core analytics end. Could you also go walk us through maybe like the linear structure in terms of, how, for example, if like, we might have over here with us a lot of people who are just graduating from colleges. So, I mean, what does their like, career path, leading to like a head of data scientist, for example, like what does that career path look like for them?
So when people actually start their data science or analytics journey, they essentially start from the very bottom in terms of being an analyst in the data science vertical. So being an analyst essentially means that you have to actually do things on the ground with your hand in terms of how do you get the all the data together. Do I have, let's say, write Python queries? I need to write SQL queries. I need to, let's say, integrate data. I need to do a reconciliation. I actually need to get a UAT done. So all that essentially becomes, a lot of the people, they start their career, and this part usually remains for about 4 to 5 years. And what is essentially encouraged in this part of time is people essentially focus on understanding the business.
Arihant, are you able to hear me? Well, in the meanwhile, while we just, try to figure this out with Arihant, if you have any kind of, questions, and again, this is for all the attendees. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to use like the Q&A tabs on your phones or your laptops to at least ask us some questions. I think we have Arihant back now. Hey, Arihant, are you there? Can you hear me?
Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes, we're able to hear you and see you.
I'm really sorry for this. I think some blip in the network, but it was showing quickly. So I was saying that, so people essentially start with that level, and what is encouraged at that level essentially is for people to work on, different stacks. So if you are essentially working on data engineering, try to learn data science, or you try to learn visualization. And then the second most important aspect is essentially you need to focus on understanding the entire business scenario. So if you are working essentially on procurement, understand how the procurement as a cycle work. Or if you are essentially working on, let's say, consumer markets as an industry, understand how the industry works. If you are essentially working on, let's say, financial services as an industry, because data science at the end of the day, you would both need the functional skill as well as the technical skill. So once people essentially spend some about 5 to 6 years, they essentially want to become managers in the practice, where the typical role of a manager essentially in a data science team would be to manage the projects in terms of one, essentially managing the team who is delivering the project, but the larger role essentially is interacting with the client, understanding the functional requirements, and telling the team what needs to be done. Yeah, two skills becomes very, very important. One, essentially understanding the business perspective, because that essentially helps you to interact with the business very well. And the second one essentially is a technical skill, because with that kind of experience, you are expected to be, let's say, an architect in the team, so that you can essentially resolve those things better. And once people spend that time, they do multiple projects, and over a period of time, people essentially let's say go on and become the head of data science, where they essentially have got a team of, let's say, about 40-50 people within the organization, which essentially delivers these things. And these teams can be as large as let's say 800 to 1,000 people for some of the largest of the organizations.
Mhm. Okay. So essentially, like the journey that you're saying is, from an analyst to a manager to like the head of data science as such, right?
Absolutely.
So again, when we speak about the analysts, could you give us quick walkthrough of, what could an analyst do on any given day as such, in terms of maybe what is like a typical day in the life of a data science analyst?
Sure. So Joy, so a typical life for a data science analyst, I would say that, he would be typically working on a business problem, because and any analytics you do, the end objective of doing an analyst is analytics project or analytics, use cases, that, you provide some insight to the business, which essentially helps them in taking the decision better. So you are essentially working on a on a specific use case. So whenever a analyst starts working on it, the first thing, he essentially interacts with the business people in terms of understanding the business scenario. If he's, let's say, working on a sales project, he needs to essentially understand, okay, what's a primary sale, what's a secondary sale, how do people track it, how do you essentially, let's say, marry the sales with the geography, how do you essentially push your distributors getting more sales. So one, essentially understanding the domain. And he would typically in a day would have multiple conversations with business in terms of understanding the requirement. The second, essentially, thing that becomes a part of his life essentially is doing the actual coding in the system. And rather than coding, I would say that developing the entire data science routine in terms of how do you get the data, because getting data from the base systems has got its own challenge. So if I am essentially doing a sales problem, if I have to get a primary sales from a ERP and a secondary sales data from our DMS, which let's say system is there, what is the database, what are the tables in the background, you would essentially need to map that to the table and the field level. And then how do you essentially connect that within your system to how do you inject the data. And then essentially you start doing all the logics on top of it, and then essentially you look at a visualization. So a typical data day of our data analytics would essentially be with respect to understanding the business problem, then essentially doing some coding, and then again doing a UAT and those kind of things.
Sure. I think that's a very, very helpful answer. And I think that takes us to the big important question, which is like the holy grail of this webinar, everybody. And I can safely say on behalf of like the 100 odd people that we have here today is, if I want to become a data scientist today, or if I want to become like a data analyst today, how do I get started? What's like my first 5 things I should be focusing on, the first 3 things I should be looking at?
So, yeah, the first 3 things in terms of data analytics is, one, essentially understanding what the data analytics is. Second, essentially understanding a language in which a data analyst thing is, and be it a R, be it a Python, be it essentially, let's say, the big data thing like a cloud on Azure or AWS. So one essentially is getting those technical skills. The third thing essentially is understanding the business. And the most important thing, apart from all these 4, is having an attitude to say that, okay, you give me a business problem, I will essentially solve it. Because, if you have the attitude, then you will be able to understand the business, and you will be able to rationally find, what are the factors that affect it. So I would say, the number 1 is attitude, but, more from a technical and business skill perspective, it's also the package, it's also the language, and then it's also the business they need to understand.
Okay. In fact, just earlier in your conversation, I think you had alluded to the key difference between these 3 pillars, right? I think there was one on engineering, one on like the core data science, and one on like the visualization part. Can you
Right.
throw some light in terms of, I mean, is it important for like an aspirant to know all three, or is it important to know, one from the other, which is like, more important than the other two?
So, Joy, I would say, see, all the three are equally important because, if you have to solve a problem, essentially, you would require all the three. The data science essentially. So, if I look at from an analytics project perspective, about 80% of the work is essentially data engineering. Then 10% is data science and 10% is visualization. But then again, data engineering is probably, a lot of work, but then essentially data science and visualization is where you would also need understanding of the business, which again becomes very, very important. So if you see, people essentially can start from any of these to start in their career, but over a period of time they should look at actually becoming expert in at least two of the three. If they become an expert in all three, that's like nirvana. But two of the three is they would be required to do on some let's say 2 or 3 years down the line.
Sure. No, I think that's a very, very important input, and I would like to extend this out to all the attendees on this webinar today. That between like data science, which is the core, like the analytics brain behind what you're doing, one on the engineering side, and the third one on like the visualization or like the reporting side. I think all three are equally important. But I mean, as per like Arihant, I'll just go summarize quickly. If you can focus on two out of these three, that's a good way to get started and hope to get inroads into the world of analytics. Very quickly, Arihant, one question that just keeps coming to everybody's mind these days, and I think it's like the question of the season. What is the impact of COVID-19 and like the coronavirus issues? We keep hearing about it all the time. I mean, what is like the real on-ground impact today in the field of analytics?
So, Joy, I would say, see, coronavirus has actually impacted almost every industry. And, when I say every industry, from a consumer markets to, let's say, industrial markets to a pharma to a healthcare, it has impacted all the industries. And, the reason analytics has become more important today because all industries essentially, because of the impact, they are essentially looking at one, essentially more insights. The second, they are essentially looking at somebody helping them getting more efficient. The third one is essentially getting some sight of the futures. If I look at consumer markets, they essentially are looking at saying that today, let's say, logistics has become a challenge. So can I essentially look at efficiency in logistics? Can I essentially have some view in terms of how do I make my logistics efficient? So if I essentially take, let's say, financial services, now reaching out to the customer, looking at a customer 360 has become very, very important. From our industrial markets, where essentially you're supposed to follow social distancing in manufacturing, people are essentially looking at, what is the impact of, let's say, coronavirus social distancing on my entire manufacturing process, which leg will essentially become slower, and how does it affect the overall production. So I would say then, and that's the feeler that we are also getting from the market, saying analytics has become more important in terms of COVID. And then second, essentially uh, all of this has also led to a lot of I would say problems outside the country as well. Like you see a lot of essentially things getting impacted and job losses in US. Then a lot of focus essentially is on can you deliver, let's say, the analytics projects at much better rate from India and at a much higher quality, so that overall cost efficiency essentially is passed on to the business. So I would say, it's a difficult time, but definitely analytics as an industry, would contribute more to each of the industry verticals today.
All right. And when you talk about these industry verticals, or in other lame words, maybe say like these like sectors within the industry today, because at KPMG, I'm sure you have a lot of interaction with your clients, which would be from across all sectors. In your view, or in your opinion, which like sectors might be the first ones to recover? Again, I'm only looking at like the light at the end of the tunnel, but I mean, just assuming that everything gets back to normalcy and we start moving towards normalcy after maybe 3 months or so. In your opinion or in your view, what are the top two or three sectors that come to mind, which would go lead the recovery for the rest of the economy?
So if you look at, generally, I think a lot of sectors, not all, but a lot of sectors essentially are coming to recovery. So I can, in general, some of my views. Uh, See, telecom is the industry industry which is as a sector is doing very good, because suddenly with work from home and all of these things, internet connectivity has become the basic, and that's what is essentially driving demand for telecom. Again, financial services and banks, that's another industry which will essentially come back fast, and in fact I think they would have come back. Again, FMCG and consumer durables are again an industries which actually have already back on track. So if you look at, let's say, the Q1 results of some of the FMCG organizations, they probably might not be as good as Q1 last year, but they would be, let's say, at a 75-80%, which actually people never expected. So I think from a FMCG perspective, from a consumer markets perspective, the sector is also doing good. Then a lot of spending actually is coming in government as a sector. At this point in time, in fact, government across the globe actually is spending a lot, so that they essentially pump in money into the people's hand.
And when it comes to all these kind of, like a bailout packages, or we can call it what we want, but I mean, are you seeing that there is like, in fact, a significant uptick in terms of an impact of something like that? Of these kind of, like bailouts that are coming in from the governments, or any kind of, in fact, the stimulus packages which like these governments are now issuing out, across your clientele. Are you seeing that, they now are able to, push faster, hopefully get to
Yeah, I
a
would say
faster?
it's a mixed response. So for some of the stimulus, that essentially works like an injection in bodies, and it is essentially helping organizations do better. For some of the stimulus, it is more of a mixed reaction and more of, let's say, a long-term thing, saying that I might, let's say, improve some things at the ground, but in terms of that essentially getting benefited to the organizations, probably will take some time.
Understood. And I think on that note about like the whole just global economy as such, I think there are like a lot of these like visa limitations nowadays. At least in the US particularly, and we keep hearing how these kind of things might impact certain jobs. I mean, in like with that background, I mean, is there a view, or like how would you rate like the prospects for data science aspirants in India, while this is happening in the US?
So, Joy, I would say actually, whenever there is certain kind of visa restrictions in any of the countries, from a IT perspective, and more from a overall India as a offshoring location, it actually benefits. In fact, one is a view coming from SIs that all the large SIs will have to get a lot of things done from India. The second view essentially is also coming from captives, and the captives then in India are huge. So something like HSBC would have probably, let's say, 40-50,000 employees, and some of the banks again have captives in this range in India, and a lot of jobs essentially, if they don't go to SIs, will essentially come to these captives, and these captives again are hiring data science and analytics resources in tons these days. So that's another market for people to get into analytics.
Sure. Great. I think we have a few answers from you on like about the industry as a whole. Before we move into a little more nuances about this particular program, we've got a bunch of questions. From we've got about 20 odd questions. So while we have allocated some time towards like the latter half of this webinar for like to answer those questions, I'll just go summarize them into my questions, which I ask you as well, so that we don't have to go through all 20 of them. And of course, as we speak, we will keep getting more and more questions. So there's, one question that just comes to mind, which I'm going to go summarize out of like a lot of other questions which we have received, is on, what is your view on the most like, popular tool in data science and machine learning, by extension? I think when I look at the questions, there are quite a few questions where people want to know, what is the right tool or the right kind of platform that they should be looking at.
So, Joy, some of the tools which have become very popular today from a data science perspective are R and Python. And then, from the overall analytics perspective, actually, the thing is actually shifting from on-premise to more of cloud. So in cloud, you typically have got about three stacks. One essentially is the Microsoft Azure stack. The another one is a AWS stack, and the third one is a GCP, Google Cloud Services stack. So all three stacks essentially have very, very, I would say robust systems in terms of analytics, data science, as well as data engineering. So all of them are a data lake, a data warehouse, and a data science kind of setups where you already have got APIs in all the three stacks, which essentially help you to do a lot of data science things with the help of those APIs. So, I believe, cloud is the next big thing which will happen in analytics. And as I say, it is already happening. So if you look at the kind of queries in the market, a lot of them are essentially for cloud platforms. And then I think on, from a language particularly perspective, Python essentially and R both are, are probably the foremost of languages which are available for being a data scientist.
So when you choose like a language, and again, this is an extension to the earlier point we were talking about, on what grounds would you choose like a language? If I'm like a layman and I don't really understand anything about analytics, but I know there is R, which is typically used a little bit more for things like statistical use. And there's like Python, which is more widespread, and it's got a lot more options as such. I mean, what kind of projects would you use R for, and what kind of projects would you use Python for?
So, Joy, see, if we look at last, 20 years, see, language essentially they keep on changing. So every 5 years you have a new language taking over. So if 10 years back it used to be, let's say, ClickSense, it used to be SAS. Today it is more of, let's say, Python, R, and a lot of these things. I would say it is less to do with a language, but more to do with what understanding of the concept and the understanding of the syntax. Because if you look at between the languages, the syntax is probably the thing that changes. Otherwise, the concept, the understanding of how it needs to be applied, that is something which remains constant with the language. So I would say, the more focus should be on understanding the concepts and application of the language. Then think, so all languages, which are relevant today probably will not be relevant 3 years, 5 years down the line. And this is something which is, the field is fast developing, and typically the entire platform gets obsolete in about 5-6 years.
Understood. But in your opinion, because now most of the work is happening on the cloud, you have in fact languages like Python which are best suited for those kind of requirements, is it?
Absolutely, Joy. So Python, the advantage is Python essentially can all the three cloud platforms have got interface where you can essentially use Python, and then essentially it is being used in a lot of other stacks as well.
Correct. Understood. Sure. I think, with that backdrop and with that background, we would now like to move on to the next half of the webinar. I think we're working like clockwork today, so that's a good thing. If we can maybe spend like the next 10 to 15 minutes on the program particularly, which is like the data science program, which we have in association, in fact, in collaboration with KPMG in India. We would like to quickly, understand a little bit about the partnership that we have with each other, in interest of like the larger audience today. And I think once that is done, we'll then open up the floor for like a few questions as well from the attendees. So again, before we move into, like the details of the partnership, I'll be happy to spend about 2-3 minutes just giving you a quick view of the program. And this is for all the attendees we have today. The Data Science Pro degree that we run in association with KPMG in India is a 4-month program that is delivered across 140 hours, and it is delivered across 2 different channels, which is like the classroom environment as well as the online environment, which means you can consume this either by coming into one of our classrooms. We have classrooms at Imarticus across 12 different cities in India, pretty much all like the top tier cities that you can think of. Apart from that, we also have the ability to deliver all our trainings online. In fact, now, obviously, in light of COVID, we have moved all our trainings online, but eventually these will also be delivered in the classrooms. And at the end of this program, you would graduate with a co-branded certificate, which would be along with KPMG in India, as well as with Imarticus Learning. So with that backdrop and with that background again, would you be able to give us a little bit more about this collaboration that you have done with Imarticus Learning? I think you're on mute, Arihant. You might need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Sure, Joy. So I'll talk about the partnership. In fact, I'll tell you why we are essentially looking at this partnership, from a KPMG perspective. See, when we were delivering these services to clients, and when in general, more from a industry perspective, there is always shortage of a good data scientist, in the market. So when essentially you look at, people with analytics and data science background, one, essentially the skill set is short. Second, essentially a lot of people essentially focus on more of a bookish knowledge in terms of, okay, this is the thing that I need to do, but how do you apply that to a more of a practical sense in terms of how do you essentially solve, let's say, a sales problem, or how do you solve a finance problem, or a procurement or a logistics problem? That essentially becomes very important. And then third part essentially is understanding various systems in the organization. So you should essentially understand how a ERP works, how a CRM works, how a SCM work, how essentially, let's say, a distributor management system work. And that's the reason, of coming together with the Imarticus for this program, is essentially giving people a more practical view of the analytics and data science. One, essentially they read about these concepts, they essentially know this concept. The second part is essentially how do you apply these concepts more to a real business scenario. So how do you, let's say, apply this to essentially, let's say, a hiring problem? How do you essentially apply this to a raw material procurement problem? How do you apply this to a sales enhancement problem? So that essentially becomes very key. So the basic objective of, Imarticus and KPMG joining hands is we essentially want to give people experience of, one, essentially the skills in terms of technical skills. The second, essentially, how do you apply in a business problem? So that's the overall thing. Sure.
So again, when we go a little bit deeper in the collaboration, in interest for our attendees, I'll just quickly walk them through, what is the partnership and like the collaboration that we have. So the first is, we are creating a capstone project with KPMG in India, and these projects will also be aided by like the project mentorship, which is a feature where our learners, will get access to experts at KPMG, who will actually be creating these projects. Can you walk us through a little bit in terms of what are these capstone projects? Maybe a few examples, if there are.
Sure, Joy. So in fact, these projects essentially are coming from the perspective in terms of the real business problems on which we have worked upon. Like, on one of the, problem that, we work a lot is on, let's say, the sales forecasting, saying how do you essentially, let's say, look at the historical data and predict sales for an organization. Does it essentially involve, let's say, blips in terms of, do you need to consider weather as one of the factors affecting it? Do you need to consider, let's say, population of the area another factor affecting it? Do you need to essentially look at seasonality around it? Because you would have, let's say, products like electronics which is sold more in the Diwali season, and then essentially there's a seasonality in terms of just ACs just before essentially the summer starts. So how do you essentially do a sales forecasting that essentially takes care of all these things, not just, let's say, a linear thing saying 10% of the last year sales as this year's target? So that's one of the capstone project that we have. The second essentially capstone project that we have is on solving the hiring problem. So hiring essentially is a very important aspect for all organizations today. In fact, hiring is typically the top investment that organization makes. And let's say wrong hiring is actually, is regarded as at least, 4 times of the money you're paying to the employee. That's the kind of money that's gets wasted for a wrong hiring. So one, essentially, we have a capstone project around where we essentially look at this hiring problem in terms of saying that, what are the roles that we should have? And then essentially the people leaving the organizations, can you predict that, okay, these are the guys who might leave the organization because of this particular reason, and can I address those reasons, and can I essentially take care of those assets to the organization, so that these employees essentially don't leave the organization with the required skill and the experience they have in the organization, and I don't have to essentially replace them with people who may know the subject but may not know the essentially organization. So essentially it takes time for them to bringing on to speed. So that's another capstone project that we have.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very interesting combination that you've chosen for these capstone projects, because they are quite agnostic of industry, which means because they are quite functional, because it's on sales and HR. You could use it across pretty much all sectors and industries today. And the other good thing is that you also covered both parts. You've covered like the revenue part and the cost part, which means today if sales forecasting is a large issue for a lot of organizations. And the accuracy to forecast accuracy, if you're able to keep that as close to 100%, I think that's one of like the biggest challenges that people face today. And the other one, of course, is identifying like a very, very high risk attrition case. And if you're able to just go foresee the attrition before it really happens, I think it will save organizations a lot of time and effort. So I think these are very good combinations that you've chosen. The other one is on like the mentoring piece, right? For these capstone projects in particular. Could you walk us through what does that mean and what does that entail?
So the objective of mentoring is we've got people essentially who are delivering these advanced analytics project as part of their everyday life. So we essentially want to bring those people in terms of essentially working with the teams in the program so that they can mentor the team in terms of what's the formula to apply, what's the logic to apply, and what's the business understanding. So things like saying that if I'm doing a sales forecasting, let's say for a fertilizer industry, is rainfall an important factor to consider or not? See, an organization would have a historical sales for even for last 20 years, but how forecasting is much better when you essentially get data from outside the organization. So is rainfall a factor for, let's say, fertilizer sales? If let's say a cultivable land in a state is a factor for, let's say, fertilizer sales. So they essentially mentor the people in terms of application of the business problem. So if you are essentially doing let's say attrition analysis, what are the different factors? Do you essentially look at education of a people? Do you essentially look at people coming from, let's say, metros versus non-metros? Do you essentially look at graduate aspirations versus postgraduate aspirations? So these are the aspects that essentially people who have solved this problem for organization in the real world, they essentially come and help the groups in developing capstone projects which are more closer to the real business problem.
And yeah, apart from the capstone project, I understand that we are also be we will also be creating these kind of case studies, right, which are more aligned to the just real business problems which could be faced. Can you tell our audience today who is here, in terms of how do these kind of case studies help them? How does it go add value, to their candidature or to their resumes?
So some of the case studies, again, where we are focusing on the case study is more on the functional part and the industry expertise. Like we've got one case study in terms of understanding the entire consumer goods as a organization, because consumer goods again is a very, very active sector, and a lot of jobs of analytics are there, and consumer goods as a sector. So in terms of one, essentially understanding how does, let's say, a sales happen in a consumer goods, how does a procurement happen, how is SCM happens, how a HR happens, how a finance happens, and then also understanding, let's say, the IT landscape in terms of do you have a ERP, do you have a distributor management system, which transaction is captured where. So if I essentially walk through about the entire sales cycle, then essentially, okay, the primary sales comes from ERP, so, and the secondary sales comes from DMS. How do you marry both of them? Do you essentially marry it on a SKU? Do you marry it on a serial number? What is the definition of SKU? So these are some of the finer aspects that we essentially try to cover in the case study, where so that you learn about that industry. In fact, another one is on industries like IT, ITES, and then manufacturing. Again, in IT, ITES, we put a lot of focus on operations, because the efficiency and the profitability of a IT, ITES organization depends on what is the utilization of them, of their resources, because utilization becomes the key metrics for people to become profitable. So giving information about these things, about the key KPIs for an industry, what are the things they need to look at when they are doing analytics for that industry, these are the kind of things that we cover in the case studies.
Understood. Perfect. So I think, with that, we have pretty much answered a few of the questions that we had on like the data science pro degree. We can now open up this thing for a few Q&As. I think we have a bunch of Q&As, I think 27, that is a large number to answer. But we will obviously, try to go summarize questions. I think like a lot of different questions are aimed at the same objective or the same answer as such. So maybe if we can get started with that, that'll be helpful. So I'll be happy to go moderate this a little bit. If you're around, Ved, if you'd like to help me along with this, we can do it together. Uh, he's on this call as well. So I'll just quickly have a look at a few of the questions. One question that stood out earlier was about about the language or about the tool as such, that which is like the right platform or the right tool to undertake. The other questions that come up a little bit is that, is it enough? I'm again referring to a question that I have from Ashwarya Archarekar, who says that, is it enough if we learn tools like Python, SQL, Tableau R only, instead of doing a whole data analytics program? Would you prefer a tool first approach, or would you go recommend somebody to do an entire program with all different tools?
Ashwarya and Joy, see, my view is, data analytics, as I said earlier, it's less about the tool. Understanding the concept is more important. Saying that, where do you essentially implement, let's say, a random forest algorithm, and where essentially you do a linear regression is something which the language will not tell you. See, I would say, language, you would still get coders in the market, when you get into industry. But more important essentially is understanding, what do you want to see, let's say, in sales of an organization? What are the key KPIs to analyze sales? How do you increase sales? What are the factors that contribute to that? Or let's say on the procurement side, how do you bring the cost down? So in my view, essentially, I would say that, see, the language is important. It's not that it's not important, but I think the entire concept and understanding data analytics as a concept is more important than the language.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question that, again, I'm just going to go summarize a few of the questions, is that there are a lot of people who are asking about the importance of coding, right? I'm going referring to a few questions which have come in from Firdos, couple other people, Bandhu, Pawn, etc. One of the questions that they all seem to ask is about whether I need to know how to code to make or to enter the analytics landscape. So
right. So, Joy, like I was saying that, a typical analytics consists of three things. One essentially is data engineering, which is largely coding. Data science, again, is largely you apply the advanced analytics part on and the algo part of it, and then essentially visualization, which essentially is a mix of both. So I would say, see, I would not say that, coding is most important to essentially doing something in data science, but I would, say, if you learn coding, then you are at least 10 steps ahead of the people who do data science and don't learn coding. So this is like saying that, I am driving a car, but do I know how to fix a car? So the person who knows how to fix the car definitely has an advantage when you are going, let's say, 1,000 miles, rather than essentially a person who only knows how to drive a car.
Understood. Okay, no, that makes sense. I agree. And actually, by extension, also the other question that I wanted to ask you is, a lot of people are already doing a finance program with us today. I'm referring to
Right.
Ankit Jain, who's asked a question about, can you suggest, how can data science help in the capital markets profile as such, because a lot of programs we do at Imarticus, there are a few others as well in this list who have mentioned that they're already undertaking these just investment banking programs with us. And if they then want to move into a data scientist role, how does that particularly help in terms of that domain experience in financial services, and in particular in the capital markets operation space? Is that helpful?
So, see, I would say, see, typically analytics has become a base for any of the course that you do, or let's say any of the departments that you have in an organization. And it is because today a lot of data actually is getting generated, and it is being available in the organization. So, in capital markets, again, you would actually have a lot of data, and one, essentially understanding which data to marry, and second, essentially understanding how to marry. The person who understands both the aspects will definitely, his results would be better than somebody who knows just how, in terms of what to do and not how to do. So I would say, data analytics today, if you look at any department and any industry, data analytics has got an element into every industry and every department. So, anybody with data analytics definitely is valued more than somebody who does not understand data analytics.
Understood. No, and I think, by extension, to answer like a few of these questions, even in my previous organization where I used to work in like a financial services organization, and this was back in 2008, 2010, and we used to do a lot of like back testings, etc., which was, in my view, like a very, very like just primitive way of going running like analytics on a large set of data. And these kind of things help a lot. So I think even if you are from the investment banking operations side, or even if you have other roles in like the larger umbrella of financial services, I think the application of analytics in the BFSI extended domain is extremely large. Um, while we are on the subject of different sectors, I have a question from Sunil Kumar Gowda, who says, or who rather asks, could you also give us some information on the application of data analytics in like the oil and gas industry? He's asking if somebody with about 10 years of experience in oil fields wants to switch to data science. Are there any oil companies that look at like say data science or analytics as a function within that sector?
So yeah, I would say that there are a lot of use cases on the data science in oil and gas, and in fact, a lot of work is being done in oil and gas industries on the analytics side. So one, essentially, there is a view on the functional side in terms of how do you essentially look at, let's say, the procurement, make it more efficient. How do you look at supply chain? How do you look at essentially sales, where the use cases are almost similar to other industries, but then there are very, very specific use cases which essentially look into oil and gas. So if you are essentially a oil refinery company, then essentially you look at efficiency of oil refining, and then essentially you look at the oil fluctuation and in terms of when to buy crude and when not to buy crude. Again, if you are essentially a mining company, then a lot of data, historian data, is essentially calculated by all the mining companies, and they do a lot of work essentially onto taking decisions like which, let's say, oil field to mine and which not to mine. And then again, if you come to, let's say, the third side, which essentially is the distribution one, people do a lot of analytics around, let's say, where you should essentially keep oil, where you should not keep oil, which essentially location would have more throughput, let's say, which is a neighborhood which does not have, let's say, a oil station to the nearest 10 kilometers. So these are the kind of analytics which essentially are done essentially from a downstream, midstream, and upstream of an oil and gas company. And today, again, from an oil and gas perspective, I have known some of the captives where the analytics team for an oil and gas company is upwards of 300, 400 people in India.
Interesting. So in fact, Arihant, while I hear you go on and on about this just ONG space, I was actually very curious to ask you this myself as a question that what are the key sectors where you see like a lot of interest coming in the analytics space, maybe from yours, clients, or over the last 14, 15 years of your own personal experience?
See, if you look at, it is more to do with, in fact, one is analytics adoption, and second is actually is technology adoption. So if you look at, any of the sectors, the first one to adopt any new thing is always financial services and telecom. So there are still, financial services and telecom are the leading one, and a lot of analytics spend is actually happening in these organizations. Then after, telecom and, financial services, it's largely the consumer markets, industrial markets, auto, and oil and gas essentially that follow through. And, it is more because, see, telecom and, financial services, if you look at it, is more of a B2C play. And, for them, the consumers are probably in millions and billions, and that's the reason for them analytics becomes very, very important. And then essentially the next wave of industries come in, where again, if you look at the last 2-3 years, analytics has become very, very important. A lot of use cases in consumer markets, lot of use cases in on the manufacturing side and industrial markets. Auto, again, a lot of work being done essentially on, let's say, one essentially is on the driverless cars. But if you typically buy a car today in India, all these cars essentially come with some kind of a microprocessor chip, which essentially sends data about, let's say, the performance of an engine back to the manufacturer. And a lot of essentially analytics is being done on the data that gets there. And then, oil and gas side, sometime back I talked about a lot of use cases in oil and gas. So I would say, that's again, for me, the priority list, financial services, telecom, the first one to adopt, and then essentially all the other sectors will come in.
Nice. It's I think almost like the usual suspects that you would imagine in this space. Right. I have a question from an anonymous attendee who says, or rather who asks, that if we have full knowledge about softwares like SPSS, is it still mandatory to undertake programs like this to create a career in the world of analytics?
So Joy, so I would still refer to this thing which I mentioned as some time back. It is less about the package and the let's say language. It is more about the understanding. See, if somebody understands which is the algo that you need to put in, how do you essentially analyze the data science problem, how do you essentially understand the industry from which it is coming from, what are the levers for that, then probably knowing a package with an added advantage. But I think these are the things that people essentially have to think whether they understand these things and then take a decision whether they would want to do this course or not.
Understood. I'll just quickly, also go mention the time. We have another 5 minutes or so. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask us these questions in the Q&A tab. I will try my best to get most of them answered through Arihant, and if not, at least I'll try to go summarize them together so that you'll at least get partial or complete answers to your questions. Feel free to put these down in like the Q&A. If you're using it on your phone, you should have it at the bottom. Or if you're using it on your computers, also you'll have one option called the Q&A where you can ask your question either anonymously or with your name. Right, so just a couple more questions, and again I'm going to take two different questions at the same time. So one is from Kavya N, who says that she's from Dayanand Sagar College and she's pursuing her final year BE in computer science. She wants to know if she wants to get into the field of data science as a fresher, what are her prospects, and what's the right way to just go about it. And to put you in a little bit of like a spot, I will ask you another question, which is from Kailesh Singh, who has over 14 years of experience and now wants to enter the world of analytics. I mean, is there a view that you have for candidates across this spectrum?
So Joyce, data science as a field essentially is open to people from across the spectrum. So I think there would be different levels and challenges when people essentially go into analytics. Somebody who is essentially a fresher, he gets into analytics, the expectations essentially from a team is that you need to have basic understanding of what analytics is. You need to understand how it is applied, and then essentially a knowledge about the tools and analytics is something that becomes handy, and then essentially it helps you to get into a data science or a data analyst team in an organization.
Correct.
When you look at somebody with a lot of experience, let's say upwards of 7 or 8 years of experience, then essentially from a data science perspective, people essentially look at which is the industry or the domain you understand the best, and then essentially that domain essentially becomes your first most important time in terms of let's say positioning you for a data science team. And then essentially the concept essentially is on understanding the language, understanding data analytics, and how do you essentially apply data analytics onto that industry. So I would say data analytics would have let's say space for everybody, but then essentially how do you get into data analytics, the kind of value add would essentially depend on whether you are a fresher or you are essentially somebody coming with a lot of experience.
Understood. I have a few questions which have come in, from, I'm referring to the ones by Imran Sheikh, Kirti Verma. I think your questions are slightly more specific towards like the scope of like placements at the end of this program. So by definition, like, this particular program that we are doing with KPMG in India, which is the data science pro degree, does not have like, placement guarantees or like, assurances on the back of it. But we do have like, in fact, other programs at Imarticus Learning where they are aligned, to the prospects of being placed. So I would request you guys to maybe take these questions slightly, maybe in fact, just offline with, your relationship managers that you have at Imarticus, and I'm sure they'll be the right people to answer these questions for you. If you have any more questions, just feel free to use the Q&A tab, and we'll try to answer them. We have another 2-3 minutes or so, so we'll try to take as many questions as we can. One quick question that I have is, in your view, is there if you were trying to go hire somebody, Arihant, or if you're trying to hire me and I come with, 2 years of basically like, say gap in my working experience, is that something that is like frowned upon, or is that something which is all right as such?
So, if I look at, the way people are looking at us, so see, people today understand that there are situations when people are essentially have gap in their career. Probably it is some of their personal problems, or let's say something to do with, let's say in the industry prospects at that point in time. I don't think this is essentially a taboo which is essentially being looked at on, but people essentially want to understand is what are the kind of skills that you have and what you have done in these 2 years. Have you utilized it to get some new skill, or whether it is genuine or not? I think that's the only thing people are interested in doing is. And I would say that if you have a gap in your thing, the best thing essentially is to be upfront about it and tell the organization that this is the reason I have a gap, and and these was, let's say, the personal situation, and I am coming after spending some time, let's say, out of work, and I don't think it is not appreciated today. People essentially take it in a very, very healthy sense today.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think we're running out of time, so maybe I'll just ask one last question. And I think we've tried to answer, I want to assume 90% of most of the questions at least. One last question that I have, from Vijay Kumar, who asks that for him to become a data scientist, he understands that the first and the most important step is to understand the world of statistics and in fact general analysis. Is that important, like in fact, a stepping stone to have, for you to make a career in analytics after that?
So I would say, yes and no both, because I can tell you about some point in time, it was definitely a prerequisite saying that, you need to have statistics before you essentially get into data science. And because a lot of algorithms were actually coded by hand, and everybody used to essentially write everything as a coding. And if they don't understand statistics, probably they'll not be able to do it. But if you look at today's scenario, a lot of people probably don't write the core algorithm by coding. A lot of it is essentially is available as a API. So typically things like, let's say, vision to text, or let's say speech to text, all of these essentially today are available at a API. Nobody probably looks at, let's say, so you can train an NLP engine, but you don't essentially look at coding an NLP engine yourself. The same thing essentially goes with the analytics in terms of a lot of Python libraries are there, a lot of R libraries are there, where people essentially look at the data, they essentially look at factors that affect the data, and then essentially they would implement different algos which are available and see which is the best fit. Mm-hmm. So today it's not about that, these libraries are not available and people essentially look at from scratch. Definitely understanding of statistics will have, but this is not a must to have at this stage. And over a period of time, people essentially, if you are in data science field and you essentially are looking at business problems, you would definitely understand a lot of statistics with time.
Yeah, sure. I think one takeaway that I have, Arihant, from your observation is that I think these norms are just being slightly more relaxed now, right? I think you're getting a lot of people who don't have coding experience also becoming extremely good analytical, in fact, personnel. At the same time, you may not even know a lot of different tools and techniques, but you can still aspire to make a great career in the field of analytics. And to your point, even if you don't come from a great background in stats, you still today have the right kind of tools and platforms that can go tap into your analytical ability, which in general is, something which I think like a lot of organizations today would seek instead of just degrees or any kind of
Right.
certifications in that particular domain. Great. I would like to thank you once again, Arihant, for taking out your precious time for us today evening. And I'm sure we've all gone back slightly, more enlightened about the world of analytics. Because I can definitely say for myself that I have definitely done that. So I'd like to thank
Thank
you
you.
once again, Arihant. And with that, I would like to quickly conclude this webinar, and I'd like to thank all the attendees for being very, very patient with us for the last 1 year. If you have any more questions, I still see them coming in. I'm sorry we will not be able to take them on this call, but we will try our best to reach out to you separately with answers to, in fact, each of your questions. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's session.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.